Hello, thanks for joining me for another church tour. This time I'm visiting St David's Church at Carregwen in Pembrokeshire. If you've seen my video about Manordeifi Old Church, you will know it was prone to flooding and eventually replaced by a new church. Well, this is the new one. It was built in 1898 by Prothero and Phillott of Cheltenham, who joined the office of the architect John Middleton and his son and succeeded them in the practice. It was financed largely by two gentry families, the Colbys of Fenony and the Saunders-Davies family of nearby Pentre Mansion. However, this was not the first replacement for the old church, so before we look at this church, let me tell you about another. Arthur Saunders-Davies of Pentre Mansion, JP, Deputy Lieutenant and MP for Carmarthenshire, died in 1873, aged only 42, and his widow, Mrs. Frances Saunders-Davies, decided to build a church in his memory. After only 13 years of marriage, she was left with many children and quite a lot of money. She was a determined lady, and like Mrs. Brigstock of Blind Pant and Mrs. Colby of Fenony, was a force to be reckoned with in the Tyvyside area. She would sit in the cosy Pentre Mansion pew at Manordeifi Old Church and rattle the poker in the fireplace when she'd had enough of the sermon, a signal to the rector to wind up his homily. She wasn't keen on his preaching, and so she built her own church next to her house. This unofficial replacement for Manordeifi Church was opened in 1879, ostensibly for the use of the family, but open to all. That must have really annoyed the Reverend Henry Jones, the rector of Manordeifi. But Mrs. Saunders-Davies had got a licence from the Bishop of St David's, so he couldn't complain, and read the prayers at the opening service, which was held in English. The sermon was by the rector of Troyderaya, one of the Lloyd family of Bronwydd Castle, whose sermon was of a more acceptable length. The Pentre Memorial Chapel was designed by James Pearce and Oban, and pots of cash were thrown at it. It was a world away from the simple church at Manordeifi. The estate workers built it, and the Aberdeen granite pillars and other components were brought in ready done. The sanctuary was tiled with encaustic tiles with the family arms, and there were memorial tablets to Fanny Saunders-Davies's late husband and his brother, who had been killed in the Crimean War. The chapel served as their memorial, and also as the memorial to two of her children who had died. But back to St David's for now. The Pentre Chapel was not suitable as a replacement for the old church, being situated as it was in Fanny Saunders-Davies' garden at Pentre, and by 1884 she'd bought Kilwendeg House at Capel Coleman and moved there. So she and the Colbys of Fenony financed the new church here on high ground where flooding was not a problem. It opened in 1898, and it was not as grand as the Pentre Chapel. I suspect Prothero and Phillott were chosen because they were not expensive, and from the outside it is undistinguished, having a nave, vestry and chancel, and a rather feeble bell spire on the west end. It had a good roof, but was quite plain inside, something which later changed. It did have plenty of stained glass windows, though, mostly by A. L. Moore, and donated in memory of members of the local gentry. I'm not that keen on late Victorian stained glass. It can be a bit insipid, sentimental and lifeless. Most of the windows were donated when the church was built. This one, though, was put in a little later. It remembers Major Lawrence Robert Vaughan Colby of the 1st Battalion, the Grenadier Guards, Eton-educated, only son and heir of the Colbys, and killed very early on in the First World War. He was 34, already a veteran of the Second Boer War, and has no known grave. This was his parents' way of remembering him. It depicts St George, the saint of choice for windows remembering those killed in the war, and also St Alban depicted with a sword, not because he was a soldier, but because he was killed by one. He was a Christian martyr. The intention here is to convey the idea that Major Colby also died for what he believed in. The centre of the window depicts an unnamed figure with a halo, dressed in mail and drawing his sword ready to fight the good fight. The words in the top of the window, taken from the well-known hymn based on Paul's first epistle to Timothy, chapter 6, verse 12, "Fight the good fight of faith." The window dedication says he was a good son and a gallant gentleman. 5 years later his father died, and the church was the place where he would be remembered too. John Vaughan Colby died in 1919, and this impressive reredos was given to the new church in his memory in 1923. It depicts the three Marys visiting the tomb at the resurrection of Christ, a subject already shown in one of the windows given by the Howells of Glaspant. It is the work of Martin Travers, who trained with Christopher Wall, an important arts and crafts stained glass designer at the Royal College of Art, and then was apprenticed to the ecclesiastical architect Ninian Comper. The panels on the sides have heraldic shields and gilt lettering, recording it was given in memory of John Vaughan Colby and paid for by his wife, children, tenants and retainers. Tenants and retainers for only a little while longer. The estate was passed to his daughter and sold in 1927 to a Glamorgan businessman. Carregwen Church had lost its gentry patrons, but strangely it was still to gain from them in the future, because in the 1970s something dreadful happened. Pentre Mansion, though a shadow of its former greatness, was still in the same family. It was inherited by the son and heir of the racing driver Arthur Saunders Davis, and he decided to sell up. Thinking no one would want a big rambling house, he demolished it, bar one wing, and drove a bulldozer over the chapel. Both were listed buildings, but he was never penalised for this act of vandalism. Some fittings were removed to Carregwen, thank goodness, but many are lost. The stained glass was supposed to have gone to Pembrokeshire Museum Service, but in fact they don't have it, and what happened to it is a mystery. What happened to the lectern and other smaller portable items, I don't know. The font, the organ and the pulpit are all now here in St David's, Carregwen, and they're worth a detailed look. The font is octagonal and made of marble. It stands on a base of Aberdeen granite. Each of the 8 faces is decorated with symbols in mosaic. J.P. St Auban used Salviati mosaic in at least a couple of his churches, and I would think that the mosaic here is by Salviati. The pulpit is similarly made of marble and mosaic, with depictions of the 4 evangelists, St Peter and St Paul. The only photograph we have of Pentre Memorial Chapel is in black and white, but seeing these fittings now gives us an idea of how colourful it must have been. The altar cross and processional cross with cabochons were probably the gift of one of the gentry families, and I don't think came from Pentre. I visited this church just after the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and this banner was on display. It was bought in 1936 in advance of the coronation of King Edward VIII, due to happen in spring 1937. But of course it never happened because he abdicated in December 1936, so it was brought out again a year later for the coronation of George VI, and again for King Charles III. I hope you enjoyed this tour of St David's, Carregwen. The church isn't normally open to visitors, but I found it interesting and I hope you did too. If you did, please remember to click the like button, subscribe to the channel if you would like to know when new videos come out, and have a look at the many other videos I have made, including some church tours. And as always, thank you for watching.